work on our clean energy programs. I'm the director of those programs, and the biggest is our SolSmart program. So this is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's been around for 9 years, and we work directly with and for local governments to help them navigate best practices in solar energy. And that's everything from planning and zoning to their own procurements or project developments, really kind of all aspects of what local governments might want to do as they participate or engage with solar development. So I'm a planner by training, AICP certified, and have worked with local governments for about 20 years on the full range of kind of climate, energy, and sustainability issues. So really excited to talk to you all today, and yeah, we'll answer any questions that you have and be available after the webinar as well.
Great, thank you, Deb. And I'm Sarah Brock, as I mentioned. I run the Circuit Rider program at Clean Energy New Hampshire. Clean Energy New Hampshire is a not-for-profit. We have an office in Concord, but we serve communities statewide. We are focused on leading New Hampshire's clean energy transition. So that tends to look like providing expert guidance for policymakers, connecting all manner of stakeholders across many sectors, and in my team, providing direct project support in communities statewide. For municipalities and small businesses primarily. Just to give you a hint, this is the Circuit Rider team at Clean Energy New Hampshire. If you are not familiar, we have a broad statewide coverage. We are supporting well over 300 projects actively right now, and that's municipalities and small businesses, and we help with whatever you need to move a project forward, whether it's coming up with a funding plan, advising on grant writing, advising on procurement and how to navigate decision-making processes and get to town meeting, how to assess bids, all that sort of stuff. And we've got regionally based staff in 4 regions of the state, as you can see here. And we've got a couple of circuit riders that serve small businesses statewide. And then as a team, wholly, we're able to answer questions from any community, even outside these regions. So a quick bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We've got a range of folks here. My impression is there's quite a lot of local planners, some folks from statewide organizations, even the state of New Hampshire Planning Office, some solar developers, and some citizens who are just interested in this sort of thing. So this is a session that's approved for continuing education credit if you are a planner, but it's pretty broad and should be applicable to all of you. We're going to have a bit of context from Deb at the start about why we ought to be talking about solar and addressing it specifically in zoning regulations at the local level. I'm then going to walk you through this new resource that was published over the summer, which is a model zoning ordinance. Some of you may remember that the organization I work with used to be called New Hampshire Sustainable Energy Association, and under that name in 2018, there was a model ordinance published for solar. This is in some ways a revision and an update of that, but in many ways it's sort of brushing that aside and setting up something new that is very appropriate to now and we think will be appropriate moving into the future. That was a fairly outdated document, so I'll walk you through what's available to you now. And then we'll have some Q&A, and Deb and I will help you understand how to go about taking that model and processing what you would need to adapt and conversations you should have to bring that into something that makes sense for your local zoning regulation. So this session's being recorded. I will send around a recording to all of you and it will be posted online, so feel free to share it. Please post questions in the chat as you go along. Deb and I will be trying to monitor that. There will be time for questions at the end, but please, questions anytime. If we see something relevant, we'll address it in real time. And I want to thank a few folks that helped us spread the word about this. Thank you to Plan New Hampshire. Several of our most frequently partnered with RPCs like Southwest Regional Planning Commission, Upper Valley, Stratford Regional Planning Commissions helped us advise about how this would go and spread the word, and then all of the RPCs and other partners. So thank you. And then finally, as I mentioned, this is, you can get CM credit for this if you are a planner. This is the number. I'll throw this up at the end as well. If you have any questions, let us know. Okay, so Deb, I think I'm going to let you kick this off. Give us some context.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. So I am going to move quickly from kind of big picture to details, but let's start at the biggest picture. Why address solar in your zoning ordinance? And I'm going to go even bigger. Why should local governments be engaged in energy and energy planning? And the reality is, we're at a really interesting juncture in history where electricity demand is projected to grow in ways that it hasn't for the last several decades. So there is an increasing demand and projected unprecedented increases in demand for electricity. And you are going to see new generation being built and being proposed. That's not just going to be solar. You are going to see an uptick generally in the, again, demand for energy driven largely by things like data centers and AI, as well as the electrification of transportation and heating. And we need more energy generation online. So you are going to continue to see more and more proposals for that kind of infrastructure. Now, solar is probably going to experience a little blip in the coming years. You may have heard that the federal tax credits are going to end earlier than expected. But solar has become a very cost competitive technology at the utility scale. Solar built as a power plant and basically in many cases can compete with other types of energy generations. It's a very cost effective way to generate electricity. And while we might experience, again, a little blip in the development of solar in the next couple of years, by all accounts, most folks expect that solar will continue to be a generation that is cost effective and will continue to be proposed in your communities. So maybe slightly less in the next couple of years, but I think long term, you will continue to see solar at scale being proposed throughout your communities. So we're going to get into the specifics of the solar ordinance, but before I go there, I also just wanted to back up for a minute and say, before you get into diving into the specifics of the zoning ordinance and the exact things that you're going to regulate and how, we always recommend that a community starts with a plan or a visioning process to come to some agreement, some set of goals about what it is you're trying to do. What this looks like in your community, what feels appropriate, and what are people concerned about, right? So that you can then craft this zoning ordinance to meet those needs, respond to those issues. So I just encourage you, if you maybe you've done some planning or had some community conversations, but if you hadn't or haven't, I would definitely recommend that as a starting place. It doesn't need to be a huge glossy energy plan. For smaller communities, it might just be some conversations, led by the Energy Committee or something like that. But certainly getting some sense of what the goals are, what the opportunities are, what the concerns are, before I think you dive right into working on the zoning ordinance. So I will say when I think about this ordinance that Sarah and I helped craft as a model ordinance, right? So it's meant to be adaptable to any community. Maybe you'll add some adaptations, you'll customize it to your needs. But the goals that kind of underlie the model ordinance, one is, it's based on a goal of ensuring that residents have the option to own and install solar on their own properties. And that's more about like rooftop solar or small ground mounted system, but really ensuring that that is an option for your residents. They can clearly see, that those projects are allowed and, in what standards, what kind of conditions you want to place on that, but clearly making that an available option for your residents and doing so in a way that drives down the cost of those projects because you're making it quite clear. Yes, you can have rooftop solar or you can have a small ground mount system on your property. Here's where that's allowed. Here's what those rules are. So the more that you are clear and transparent in those processes, the easier it is for a developer or homeowner to navigate and get their permit, and therefore the project is easier and is less expensive. The other kind of underlying goal, I think, of this ordinance is to make the rules for larger scale, utility scale solar more transparent. Ideally, to be clear about, the locations in your community that are appropriate or inappropriate, what the standards are, what, again, things like, the conditions will be on that development, and where it's not allowed. So again, to be really transparent in those processes so that somebody who might want to pursue one of those projects can understand what are the rules, what are the conditions, what kinds of projects do you want, and where can they be to accelerate, streamline those the projects that you want, and honestly be clear about what you're prohibiting and not allowing so that they don't waste their time trying to develop projects that you don't want in your community. So I would say those at the highest level are kind of the underlying goals in this ordinance is making sure that your residents have clear options for their own properties for what we call accessory use solar, these kind of smaller systems, whether they're on the roof or on the ground, and being clear and transparent about your rules for the larger scale projects. Um, to kind of maybe cut to the chase on why include solar in your zoning ordinance, I would say this. One, projects are going to be proposed in your community. So again, there's a projected increase in energy demand. You're going to see more proposals to generate electricity. An ordinance just allows you to more clearly influence what projects get proposed, what they look like, what they include or don't include. Number two, I'd say if you are unclear about your processes or your standards, you are adding costs to those projects and ultimately basically making those projects more expensive, making electricity more expensive, and kind of making the kind of return on investment for those projects more challenging. So the more that, again, you can be transparent, the more you're helping drive down those costs. And also, solar, at the end of the day, is a source of revenue or savings for your residents and for your community. So while solar is probably not appropriate everywhere, thinking about where it can be appropriate opens up those opportunities, again, for your residents to either save money or even make money, and for your community, for example, to get tax revenue or payment in lieu of taxes. So thinking about that and again, asking kind of where are these projects appropriate, where can they add value, or meet the standards in your community. So Sarah, with that as the high level kind of background, the next slide, we start to just jump into maybe something more specific. So we're going to go just to the model ordinance in a minute and take a look at it and what's in there and why. But a few points of advice that, again, I think are answered in the ordinance or addressed in the ordinance. One, our advice is to explicitly recognize and address different forms of solar development. So solar has changed so much. I've been working in this field for 20 years, but large-scale solar did not exist as a land use for the first 10 years of that. So many things have changed. We have solar being installed in all different ways. So whereas communities maybe used to just have a definition, and that mostly meant rooftop solar, there's a lot of nuance now, a lot of different types of projects, different scales of projects. So we need to make sure we're covering all of them. Here on the second on the list, creating by right or permitted installation opportunities. So again, being clear about what is allowed. Obviously, as long as it meets electrical code and other things that you might set out, but being clear what projects are permitted, are absolutely going to be allowed in the community. Setting clear and predictable standards where you're really balancing, what you want from solar resources with other, competing land use goals, other things. But as much as your community can be clear and transparent and set out a predictable process, so developers know what they have to do, and if they do those things, that the project will, move forward. Again, that reduces costs and saves everyone from kind of wasting their time on projects that aren't going to be acceptable. Avoiding unintentional barriers to solar. This sounds a little vague, but we see this a lot where, communities have added different components or requirements that honestly aren't adding a lot of value, but are creating barriers. So for example, things about the color of the panels or not being clear kind of where they're allowed. So that's something that SolSmart helps communities identify. Often if you have an unintentional barrier, it's hard for you to see. So we often, can help do zoning reviews and help look for those unintentional barriers that you might not even recognize are there. Enabling the desired co-benefits. This gets back to having that community conversation and understanding what else are you trying to do. So an example is, we have some communities who are really concerned with how they're going to redevelop a brownfield site, and they have a contaminated industrial site, and they don't, they want it to generate revenue. You can potentially solve two challenges in one. If you can put solar on that site and generate revenue, and we've seen that then, be able to fund other projects on that same site. So thinking about what are your unique opportunities or unique goals, and trying to find kind of those win-win scenarios as much as possible. Again, related to the planning with your community, or considering the concerns that people are bringing and how you're going to set conditions to manage for those. So that can be about historic preservation. It could be about aesthetics or other issues, but understanding what people are worried about and then making sure that we're thinking about that in the regulations. And then the last one here is maintaining consistency with your larger region. So the reality is, if we're trying to help solar be developed or reduce costs, most solar developers are working across the region. And as much as we can have some similarities in what everyone is doing, we can build markets that actually drive down those costs in more meaningful ways. So checking in with your neighbors, if you will, and as much as possible, kind of trying to have similar approaches or similar standards. So that is my high level advice. In a second, we're going to talk through the ordinance and show you that. But the next two slides, I just want to plant a seed so everybody kind of has it in their mind. Like, what are we trying to set zoning regulations for? What are the kind of universe of projects that we might see that we're going to call solar projects? So starting with, probably the one that's been around the longest, residential roof-mounted solar, right? So when we look at this ordinance, we're thinking about how we're going to regulate the PV that people want to put, or solar that people want to put on their roof. That can also be on a commercial roof, which is generally a larger scale project, not always. Sometimes it's on a flat roof. So again, a different project type, thinking about how we're going to, regulate those. And then the third picture here could be at someone's house or business, and this is what we call accessory ground-mounted solar. So it's an accessory to the primary structure. It's creating the electricity that's going to go to that building that's located right there. And that's a unique type. This is a little different. You can't kind of put all ground-mounted solar in the same bucket. Accessory ground-mounted solar means it's serving the electricity load right there. On this slide, we're showing what we call primary use solar or principal use solar. So this is not connected to a building nearby. This is grid connected, right? It's serving the larger grid. This is a power plant. The picture in the middle is the same thing, but it's including more agricultural uses. So we call this agrivoltaics. Some folks talk about ecovoltaics, but it can have plantings. It can have, it could be growing crops. It could have grazing on it. We've seen sheep or goats. Again, these are unique project types, and being clear about what your community wants or wants to encourage or doesn't want is really important. And then the last thing here, I include solar with storage. And this gives you a picture for those larger systems, what storage can look like. As I understand it, we haven't seen a lot of this in New Hampshire yet. But energy storage, I would venture to guess, is coming. The technology has advanced considerably and is increasingly widespread. It's being proposed both with the solar projects as well as completely standalone because energy storage can solve some problems for utilities. So maybe haven't seen a lot of it yet, but I would put it on your radar as something that's coming, and to think about, again, how your community would want to regulate that or be involved in locating storage or any conditions you'd want to set around that. So again, I think keeping these project types in mind as we look through, again, what we've covered in the model ordinance and thinking through what's applicable in your community. And I think with that, Sarah, I turn it back to you.
Great. So I'm going to pop into the chat link to the ordinance that I'm about to walk you through, and I'll pull it up on my screen in a minute. I just want to reiterate what Deb said about why you would want to look at this. And I will say that the reason Clean Energy New Hampshire decided that this was the year to go ahead and try to provide more resources for New Hampshire related to solar zoning, because we were just getting so many questions. And to be totally honest with you, my team works mostly with municipalities, and most of what we are hearing are planning boards who feel like deer in the headlights because they're being approached, whether it's the select board or the planning board, by a solar developer or by a landowner that wants to do this. And it tends to be the larger projects that make them feel most squirrely, and they just don't know how to handle them. We have heard stories about developers being unwilling to go into communities that don't have solar ordinances because they've had such bad experiences there. We've heard stories about communities who have had projects come to them that they weren't necessarily against, they just tripped over themselves, and it was a waste of everyone's time, and projects fell apart as a result, and no one felt good about that. And it all just comes down to not having the proactive plan in place for how are we going to treat these projects when they are proposed so that we can process them for permitting smoothly, we can not permit the ones that don't make sense, and we can permit the ones that do. That's what this is about, trying to be proactive. And this is not conceptual. This is something we're seeing a lot in New Hampshire. So I'm going to jump into this resource. Give me a moment to throw it up on my screen. Hold on. You always have to find the share screen button, which is never where you think it is. Okay. Are you still seeing what I'm seeing? Yes. So I mentioned there was a solar zoning ordinance. Many of you are in here. This is updated, and has been published as a Google document for a reason. And you'll always see the date that we last updated it. We expect that what's here is fairly evergreen, but as we use it and we hear how communities and developers are experiencing it, we may tweak it. So this link you can share. We're currently updating our resources page on the CENH website, so there isn't a good home for this on the website right now, but you are always welcome to contact me, and I can get you a link if you lose it, and it will be up in a more obvious place by the end of the month. So my job right now in the next 10 minutes or so, probably a little more, is to just walk you through what's here. I'm not going to drill down excessively, or I will try not to. I'll try to leave time for questions if there are parts that you would like me to drill into, or Deb to drill into. So throw notes in the chat. Deb, I'm going to let you monitor the chat and the participants list while I'm yapping here so that you can interject if there's something we should drill into in real time. Otherwise, my hope is that you will come away with a solid sense of what's here that's useful to you and what you might be able to do with it moving forward. So I'll run you through this table of contents to give you a sense of what we're about to do. There's a bit of an introduction, and then there's a big meaty section of background for you. You heard Deb touch on some of this, solar trends, Solar 101, how to deal with solar in historic districts and energy overlay districts, and then this statutory authority and limitations. There's a whole section that just lists all the RSAs that have to do somehow with solar and solar planning and zoning, so you understand what bounds you've got to be working in. And then there's a little section about how to go about using this model ordinance, how the document came to be, some tips which I hope you will find helpful for how to have conversations about how to adopt this ordinance and particular things you might want to have conversations about. And then there's some related resources as well. And then finally, we get into the ordinance itself, which is meant to be something that you could copy and paste, put your name into, tweak a little bit, and adopt, with more or less adjustment, depending. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And Deb will chat a bit later about whether you might want to just lift that document entirely or whether you actually want to pull pieces of it and integrate it throughout your zoning code. We'll talk about that. So let me help you see what's here. And if you've got this open in another window, feel free to follow along or explore at your own pace. I'm going to skip over this introduction, but it gives you some of the high level. Some of what we have tried to do in this document is give you some of the language that you would need if you were going to go before your planning board or your staff or the community and explain why it's relevant to talk about solar directly in your planning code, so you should be able to lift some of this language to help you make the case and explain this to your peers. There's a whole lot of data here, and we've cited and linked to all of it. So we hope this is useful. And for those of you in the industry, this is all going to be very repetitive. But we've got some information about trends over time, which, as Deb made the case, this is a big part of why you want to address solar, because we're only going to be seeing more of it. There's a section here that we're calling Solar 101, which gets just like down to the very basics of like how big are solar panels and what are some of the different configurations? What does it mean to be in front of the meter and behind the meter? Again, if you're on this call, you probably maybe already know what those things mean, or maybe you're on the call because you don't and you need to, but we've tried to lay out some of the basics. If you're going to be talking about solar, here are the terms to know. So make use of that. I'm not going to dig into them today. There's similarly a good bit of information summary and then links to explainers about what net energy metering is, what group net metering is, hosting capacity, and links to all of the different hosting capacity maps, which is of course where you can go and see where you've got 3-phase or 2-phase or 1-phase power going through your community. Which, for those of you who don't know, you can see the bold text here. The reason that's relevant is because you really do need 3-phase power to hook up the larger systems. And the rule of thumb that's in here is that anything above about 15 kilowatts of capacity, you probably are going to need 3-phase power. There's pictures and descriptions about the scale and what kinds of mounting systems you might see in solar, which again, if you're trying to educate a planning board that knows nothing about this, this is going to be a good resource for you. Talks about different kinds of trackers, etc. Talks a bit about how much land is needed for how much capacity of solar, which when you're trying to overlay, what are we really talking about in terms of land use impact of these systems? There's some rules of thumb and some ways of understanding and explaining how much land you need in order to build solar. There's a discussion about payment in lieu of taxation pilots. There's a good explainer from Clean Energy New Hampshire that my team is actually updating literally today because we get some new information. If you haven't already discovered, Clean Energy New Hampshire is a wealth of explainers and guides that we keep quite current. So you should be in touch with us if you've got a clean energy question. We might have an explainer on it. There's some information about energy storage in here. That energy storage is addressed in this ordinance, but I would say in sort of the most basic elementary way, and that might be something that we adapt over time, but the model you are going to see in this document mentions storage, I think, in enough places that it's going to account for projects that want to be addressing storage, but we don't get very complicated. And that's partly because there's not a lot of energy storage happening right now in New Hampshire for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, but we are likely to see more of it, and let us know if you need more information about storage. There's a good section about historic districts. There's a lot of good resources that come from outside New Hampshire to break down how you do solar on historic buildings. We're aware of several really good examples in New Hampshire that you could point to where solar has been done in historic districts really tactfully and in ways that really worked well with the local historic commissions. And there's also sorts of, rules of thumb for that we've laid out here for you. There's also a section here about energy overlay districts, and there's more about that later, but so I'm going to put a pin in that and I'll describe that in a little bit. This is the section I was talking about where it lists all of the relevant laws and regulations at the state level related to solar. And what we tried to do was boil them down and give you links. But anyone who's diving into this ought to read that and sort of wrap their head around what the state of New Hampshire says about solar and where you can put it and what ought to be allowed. Okay, so that's your overview section. It's really full. If any of you who know more than I do about this stuff see anything missing or that you think we ought to include, let me know. Like I said, this is a living document. My hope is that is helpful to those of you who are trying to start conversations at the local level and are needing just a primer on what we're talking about. So then we get into the ordinance itself and some advice on how to use it. There's a description of how this thing came to be. if you're interested, which describes what Deb and I said, which is effectively that there was a document in 2018. We knew it needed to be chucked and rewritten. And this was a collaborative process to create this model that we think is appropriate and good for New Hampshire now and into the future. So there's a whole list of considerations here that we're happy to dive more into, and that's part of what I think the Q&A might consist of. So I'll be curious to know which of these you all want to hear us riff on and chat more about. But just to tease it for you, I mentioned this concept of, do you adopt it as a standalone ordinance, or do you try to bake in the components to other sections of your existing ordinance? That's a discussion. Thinking about why some of the regulations are being recommended by this ordinance. If there's a lot of resource from SolSmart to sort of break down why some of this is recommended in best practice and in the best interest of both the municipality and the resident and the solar developer. So if you're not getting it here, there's other places to get some of that rationale. Thinking about where you could use, sorry, I'm going to get my words straight here. Another conversation you ought to have is thinking about where you might actually want to have primary use solar as a permitted use. That should be a very intentional, thoughtful conversation that's tied into some of the, the goals conversation that Deborah was saying that we should all be having before diving in to this. And this ordinance draft walks you through some advice that we have on how to have that conversation. I'm not going to dig into it now, but it involves mapping and looking at where three-phase power is, looking at where you want development, and really thinking about that thoughtfully. And then it also talks about what you can do once you've thought through in terms of how to bake that into your code, whether you use your permitted use table to lay that out, whether you discover that you need an energy overlay district to try to define those areas that you identified. There's a whole lot of guidance about how to go about articulating in your regulation goals that you have set out for where you would and wouldn't want to see some of this large scale solar in your community. So I'm going to skim over that, but we can dig into it later if you would like. And then there's a bit of related resource in case you're curious. The same group that does SolSmart also does Charging Smart and Wind Smart. So for any of you that are trying to address either of those things in your zoning code, there are resources. And Deb and her team, and then these are the websites you would go to can help you with that. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what the ordinance looks like. I'm going to try to be brief because we can chat for the remainder of the time, just to give you a sense of how it's oriented and how to navigate it. It looks like a fairly standard ordinance in the beginning, the authority applicability. Any of you who are in the planning space will recognize that. We've given you some template purpose language here that of course you would want to adapt and cite your own pieces for. We've given you quite an extensive list of definitions, and we do recommend effectively adopting that in whole. Deb mentioned earlier that in an earlier time, it was probably sufficient just to define solar generation. Now, because it is so much more varied and there's so much more to consider, that we do actually recommend having quite a bit more laid out in your definitions. So we've given you what we think is a good and appropriate mix here. We've shown what a table of permitted uses might look like, and the section that I skimmed over earlier really walks you through how you would go about creating this and whether you want to talk about an energy overlay district and how you would have that conversation about where to have a little P for permitted versus conditional use permit versus use prohibited. The next section is accessory use solar. So this ordinance very specifically distinguishes between accessory use and primary use solar, rather than trying to set some sort of capacity limit. And the primary reason for that is that the technology keeps improving and you're packing more power into each solar panel. And some of the older ordinances that I was seeing in New Hampshire and elsewhere that were slicing sizes of solar for the purpose of permitting were sort of quickly becoming obsolete because the size of the array was not so related to the land use impact. So when we talk about accessory use versus primary use, that's an easier and more probably evergreen way to differentiate between the types of uses for the purpose of land use planning. So we start with a statement basically saying that this is a permitted use in all districts. That's our recommendation, and of course, that's a conversation you would have. And then we get into general standards, which address height, setbacks, screenings, lot coverage, and all of the language here is recommended best practice based on like national knowledge and all of SolSmart's history of advising folks about this, mixed with conversations with local planners and local developers about what makes sense in New Hampshire. And then throughout the document, there's footnotes. That's sort of the way that we came up with to speak directly to you, the person who might be adapting this. So the footnotes are not meant to be included in what you would ultimately publish, but they're meant to give you bits of context about why that is, or alternative language for something. So make sure you read the footnotes. And then in each of these sections, it starts with a basic statement, and then you have standards, and then the second section is submission requirements. So we broke it out in that way to simplify things for the folks who are trying to seek permitting. So this section has some specific submission requirements all grouped together. There's a whole separate section about historical buildings and districts in that accessory use section as well. And then we get into a section about ground mount solar, which is going to be in the same format, a statement here. And this is where your community would have had conversations about whether ground use solar as a primary use is ever permitted or always has a conditional use permit or that. So you would be referencing that in that intro statement, but it would be reflected in your use table. And then there's a section with standards, which are more extensive for ground mount primary use, which makes sense. And then similarly, a submission requirements section, and we would be happy to dive into the specifics in any of these if you wish. I'm scrolling quickly. There's an abandonment and decommissioning section specific to the primary use ground mount section, and that's unique. And that's the end. So I'm going to pause there. Where we're going to go from here is see what questions you all have. I hope you're thinking about how to be adapting this for your own community and how this might be relevant for you. We certainly have a couple of questions that we have gotten over and over that we're ready to answer if you are all silent, but I'll give you a moment to reflect, and then I would love to either see you throw up a hand or put a question in the chat if there's something you saw me skim over here that you'd like us to dive more into, or a more general question. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you all. Now, did we have any questions in the chat that you saw, Deb, before I dive in?
There's been some commentary. I don't know that I've seen a question per se.
Okay.
So,
Well, then I might share my screen again and let you talk through. Oh, we have a question from Michael. I'll do that in a minute. Michael says, any examples of municipalities that have used the solar ordinance already that you could point to? And the answer is no, only because it was just published, but many, many communities that are in the process of reviewing it and moving towards adoption. As I'm sure you're aware, for any of our communities that are on a town meeting schedule, the adoption of this kind of regulation would need to go to the voters. So that would have started now, but wouldn't come to fruition until March of next year for most. Anything to add to that, Deb? Okay. But I mentioned we have this cohort that's been working on looking at local solar zoning and adopting ordinances. So I do have quite a list of communities that I know are in the process of revising this model, bringing it through the paces to get ready to bring it to voters. Megan says, can you speak on long-term environmental impacts of solar panels? Even though the average lifespan is 25 years, the chemical and physical waste is a concern. Deb, do you want to take that one?
I can start an answer. I'm also curious if you have a solar developer on the call, they might
That's
also
true.
have an answer here. But I can say I know this is a top priority for the industry, and the national at the national level, the Solar Energy Industry Association has a group working on exploring what are the opportunities, whether that's recycling or um, you know uh, basically trying to figure out what are the opportunities to manage and mitigate that waste. So it is absolutely, a concern that the industry understands and is working on. I can't say that there's like a perfect solution, but I don't know if any of the solar developers on the call can speak to that as well.
If any of you would like to chime in, please just unmute and say so. Paul says there's an emerging recycling industry around solar modules. I will say that we've had some communities where voters have expressed concerns about, um, the quality of the soil and what
Runoff.
happens to the runoff off the panels when it rains on the panels and it drips onto the soils, and have been pretty effective being able to myth bust that. There's no impact really of there's no like chemicals being leached into soils from these arrays. And I think the end of life piece is a different piece and is an interesting piece. And I agree with Paul. What I'm hearing is that there's sort of an emerging industry around this, in part because we are finally at the place where some of those old systems maybe are getting ready to be retired in a way that hadn't been true in the last 5 to 10 years. And so that's more a part of the conversation now than it had been. I'm going to throw my screen back up, no problem, Megan. And let's dig into some of the questions that I know Deb and I have had. And please continue putting questions in the chat and we'll address those as well. Here you go, Deb.
Sure. So we frequently get asked of the kind of pros and cons of adopting a standalone solar ordinance versus integrating it into your existing zoning regulations. And there's no one size fits all here. We wrote the model so it can be adopted on its own. Um, but definitely, I think an important conversation to have in your community. If you have a really robust zoning ordinance already, I would generally lean toward integrating it into that ordinance. It's the one place that kind of dictates how you do land use regulation, and so it would make sense to me that the solar piece is just part of that larger pie. If you're in a community that either doesn't have zoning and wants to just have a solar ordinance, or maybe you have a fairly bare bones zoning ordinance. This model ordinance is about 10 pages long, and I don't think I'd propose to have kind of the solar ordinance eat your zoning ordinance. So if your current zoning ordinance is kind of lean and mean, it might make sense to keep the solar piece standalone. And then the other scenario is if you're already regulating other things through standalone ordinances, if it's kind of the way that your town likes to approach things, maybe you have water resources district ordinance or a solid waste district ordinance or something like that, or solid waste ordinance. If that's the way that you tend to do things, that could also, be the reason that you decide to keep solar as a standalone ordinance. So again, there's at the end of the day, it really has no substantial impact on how the ordinance works, but making that call, it was something I would do, in consultation with like your planning and zoning folks and deciding what makes the most sense for you. The second about key considerations as you work to adopt the model ordinance. So one thing is absolutely, the model is generic. It's works kind of everywhere, and so really looking at what your community does and making sure that you're integrating what's in the model back into what you already do. So example is it refers to, you may need to get other permits in our community. Like, as you adopt this ordinance, go ahead and fill that in. Like, what else does your community require? If there's other things, if you do a historic preservation review or you have something else, just make sure to kind of link back to what your community does. Um, we used the term conditional use, but and I think, conditional use shows up as like CUP in the table, but obviously linking back to what other definitions your community already has, other standards of review your community already has, to really make this work just like the rest of your land use regulation. So,
Yeah, I just wanted to pop this up because you can see how we do it
yeah.
in the ordinance. This is in the accessory use section, and this is littered with footnotes. For example, in the height section, what we really want to do is make sure that, or if you've already got a village district, you're citing it. If you've already got other height restrictions, that you're like citing those things throughout, so it is integrated and not a standalone. There's no sort of like one set of rules for solar and another set of rules for
Yeah.
everything else.
We also refer to site plan review. So again, you may have the way that your community does site plan review. So there's a little bit of work certainly to make sure that this aligns back with the things that your community already has, already does, how you refer to different processes, and just kind of link those things up so that it's pretty seamlessly integrated with the processes you already have. We're not trying to create other processes here. And then the other thing, I think as you think about that, a question we often ask communities to ask themselves is, are we regulating solar the same way we regulate similar things? So we sometimes see, for example, a community has setback requirements for, other types of development, and then maybe that's 20 feet, and then for solar, it's 100 feet. And it's like, so we just encourage you to think about what are the standards that we use for other development. So accessory sheds, we would say if whatever setbacks you're applying to a different accessory structure should be applied to the ground-mounted accessory solar. And to really kind of have a parity in how you're treating solar development, with other forms of comparable things. So, how people install other HVAC equipment, other accessory structures, things like that. The last question we also get a lot, which is, why should we adopt solar regulations if we don't have three-phase power? If we look at these maps and we don't see that we have three-phase power, why should we have regulations for large solar projects? And I guess what I would say is if that's what you're seeing on the map, I would confirm that with a few folks. Maybe talk to your regional planning commission. I would talk to a solar developer. You are fortunate in New Hampshire. You have a lot of very collaborative solar developers, I think available to you through Clean Energy New Hampshire, but who clearly, are willing to provide some advice or their perspective. But before you make the call that there's no chance this is going to happen in your community, I would just touch base with a few folks, through Sarah, and make sure that that is the case. The scenario that I hear more often than not is, we thought this could never happen here, and now we have a proposal. So I generally encourage communities to be prepared to assume if it's not coming to you now, that it will. The technology is changing, the infrastructure is changing. I tend to be more on the side of be prepared. But again, if you're going to decide that it absolutely can't happen here, I would just touch base with a few folks. And then, related to that, you can still, potentially adopt parts of this ordinance just to cover yourselves, have at least the definitions, have some language about how you would review these projects as a bit of a just in case. And I would say the same with energy storage. You may not be experiencing it now, but I would generally approach these things with an assumption it will come at some point. And Paul asks for who doesn't have three-phase power. Sarah, I don't know if you have an example. I know we've
I
heard
can't
it quite a
remember.
bit.
I know a couple folks in our cohort were looking at the maps and going, "Oh, well, we actually don't have any three-phase power in our community." There are some. We are a rural community after all, a rural state. And Paul was also making the note while you were chatting that his gut says that adopting it as a standalone might be easier in many towns because the complexity of trying to figure out how to integrate it might be more effort than it's worth, and that the the conversation might tend to be a little bit more conservative if you try to go and integrate it into every section, which is good feedback. And I think it's going to be up to every community to decide how it's going to be most efficient and effective and simple for them. I think it's going to vary a lot, community to community. And then Scott McGrath put some notes here about in regards to Megan's question around the environmental impacts. Thank you, Scott. I would say related to, thanks, Paul. Related to that question about three-phase power, we talked a bit about the discussion of sitting down with your community and really thinking through where these projects could go. And I really do hope that that's one of the takeaways of this. The exercise of getting a few folks in the community to pull up the maps from the utility and to pull up the lot maps and look at where your natural resources are, where your zones are, where you're not likely to see other development. And we're seeing a lot of communities build larger solar, and in most communities, I believe I could say this fairly, in most communities, there are places where it does genuinely make sense. That land doesn't have much other use, that it brings revenue to the community, and it's a value add to whoever the property owner is, including the municipal property owner, if it happens to be municipal land. And the conversation proactively about where in our community could we imagine seeing that, and that would make sense, is a much healthier conversation than the conversation we typically have, which is a developer comes in with a landowner that has agreed to lease this on their property, and folks get up in arms and are very defensive and very concerned, and the NIMBYism can come out, and that is a very difficult stance to have a objective, rational conversation about the benefits of solar. And unfortunately, most of these conversations happen in that defensive crouch, as opposed to in a proactive, goal-setting kind of way, where you might put an ordinance like this in before voters at a moment where there isn't a big solar project breathing down their necks and scaring them away. So being proactive and getting something in place is smart. And I hope you are all thinking about how to maybe start doing that.
Sarah, we have a question from Michael. It says, you discussed roof mounted and ground mounted. Does the model ordinance cover trackers and building integrated solar? On trackers, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you can do it.
We were probably going to say the same thing. Trackers, absolutely. I don't know that we actually address building integrated, Deb. I was trying to rack my brain about that would be considered accessory solar. Any thoughts on that?
I'm gonna say something and then someone's gonna show me what I'm not thinking of. But so I look forward to that. So when I think of building integrated, I'm thinking of things like solar, shingles, maybe even glass. In my opinion, those aren't things you regulate in a zoning ordinance. So assuming it is truly building integrated, it is a building material that the structure will be made out of. It doesn't affect the footprint, the height, it's not, that would not be something you would cover in a zoning ordinance. Tell me what I'm missing in the scenario because we can absolutely
like awnings or so, there's other ways how you can attach two buildings, like
yeah.
You can see it in commercial buildings like large warehouse or where trucks pull up, sometimes they can add to the building large solar arrays. So I mean it's a gray area, but it's not an issue. I get it. That's not the main idea of the ordinance. I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The other one I wanted to ask about were the solar trackers, because those are becoming kind of interesting, because they're just much more efficient in terms of the energy efficiency, and they also solve some of the other problems where the fixed mounted systems are just usually south facing, but they're not necessarily picking up a lot of the west facing solar radiation that could be helpful, you know, to bring down the generation, the whole problem you pointed out in the beginning, why solar is so critical is, you want to try to supplement because there's more and more electricity generation needed. So for that reason, I think solar trackers have a good future.
Yeah, solar trackers are definitely laid out, and in the introduction, we go
Great.
into all the different kinds of solar trackers and where
Excellent.
you see them. So that's addressed.
Thank you.
And
I'm looking at the time, and I do want to make sure that we wrap up. Did you have another comment, Deb?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. There's a couple of other resources here. You're going to get these slides. There's a recording of a planning and zoning training that Deb did for our cohort of towns looking at this back in April that I've got a video of, and you'd be welcome. It digs in a little bit more than we did today. And then there's also a solar at scale guidebook from ICMA that is really helpful if you want to look at some of the considerations of larger scale solar in more detail. And then SolSmart does offer free technical assistance. So Deb's email is here and also on the last slide, and you should not be shy about reaching out to inquire about how that team might be able to help. And then finally, again, here's the CM credit for AICP credit and our contact information. I will be in touch. It might be after the weekend to send a link to this and the slides. And I would just encourage you to be in touch if you and your community are considering looking at the model solar ordinance and updating your zoning regulations. I'd like to know about it because we have so many towns going through this. Our team works in a cohort way increasingly, where we try to track clusters of communities that are doing similar types of things at the same time so that we can help you all learn from each other. And so make sure you get on my radar so we can help connect you with that. And I am also happy to connect you with SolSmart. If you lose Deb's email or you forget how to get in touch with them, you can always use Clean Energy New Hampshire and me in particular as your first stop to finding the resource that you need. And with that, we're 1 minute over, and thank you all for joining us. If you have questions and want to stay, Deb and I will stick around as long as you wish to keep us. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.